Jericho, an apparently impenetrable city, with its gigantic walls and strategic position, seemed to be the final barrier for the people of Israel to reach the promised land. But what happened there, in an act of faith and obedience, turned history upside down. The Battle of Jericho was not won with military strength, but with something even more powerful: trust in God and the acceptance of a plan that defied all human logic. The walls of Jericho fell not by the force of arms, but by the sound of trumpets and shouts of faith. And the question is, what does this have to do with you today? Perhaps it's time to stop fighting alone against your own walls and realize that by fully trusting in God, you can achieve victories that seem impossible. But are we truly ready to follow this example of trust and obedience? Let's find out as we dive into this story, which is much more than just a miracle, showing the transformative power of faith. The Battle of Jericho, my friends, was anything but conventional. There were no sharp swords or great armies marching with thunderous sounds. What happened was something even more powerful: a divine strategy that defied all human rules. Joshua, under God's leadership, did not delve into the traditional military tactics of the time. On the contrary, he followed a direct command: march around Jericho for 6 days in absolute silence. And on the 7th day, a burst of faith occurred when the Israelites gave such a loud shout that the walls, so imposing and formidable, simply collapsed. This, my friends, is the kind of strategy that defies all logic, but leads to an immeasurable victory. Now, let's think about our own daily challenges. It's not uncommon that when faced with difficulties, the first thing that comes to mind are traditional solutions: physical effort, sweat, and constant struggle. However, in Jericho, the opposite happened. The strategy of war in the Bible teaches us a great lesson. Sometimes, the secret to victory lies in doing things in a way that, at first glance, doesn't seem to make sense. Victory through faith is not achieved through physical effort, but through trust in something greater than our own strength. It's not new to hear about successful strategies that break the mold. Great leaders like Steve Jobs and Nelson Mandela adopted unusual approaches, distancing themselves from the traditional expectations of their times. And just like them, Joshua also dared to follow God's plan without questioning, without hesitation. This shows that when you have the right direction, the strategy doesn't matter much. What matters is obedience and trust. We can apply this to our own lives, setting aside traditional methods and daring, in an obedient and trusting way, to do something out of the ordinary. It's hard, of course. Who wouldn't be nervous facing such an imposing city like Jericho with its impenetrable walls? However, the story of Jericho in the Bible shows us that when we follow divine guidance, our human strength becomes secondary. In fact, victory doesn't come from our own strong arm, but from our ability to trust and act based on faith. It's not an easy message, but it is a powerful message that resonates through time. Now, before we think about how the story of Joshua and Jericho ends, let's reflect on how our own walls can be overcome. How can we apply such an unusual strategy in our lives? Sometimes, it could be as simple as changing our attitude or being more patient in the face of challenging situations. Just as the walls of Jericho fell, we too can bring down ours, but the key lies in knowing when and how to act with faith. And as we talk about this, we cannot overlook the fundamental role of faith and obedience. Jericho, at the time of the Battle of Jericho, was not just any city. It was an imposing fortress with walls that seemed practically insurmountable. Imagine a structure that stood in a defiant manner, resisting any kind of conventional attack. The walls of Jericho were so powerful that, for an ordinary army, the city seemed impossible to conquer. There is no denying how these fortifications were the true defense of the city. But what seems impossible to human eyes is often fertile ground for God's miracles. Here, it's interesting to note how the greatest barriers we face in life, whether personal, financial, or emotional, often seem insurmountable. When we look at our own lives and see the difficulties ahead, the tendency is to feel defeated as if there's no way to overcome these obstacles. The fall of the walls of Jericho teaches us something fundamental. No matter how high and imposing the walls may seem, faith can turn them into dust. It's not about human strength, but about the divine power working in ways our eyes cannot see at first glance. Let's try to visualize this in our daily lives. Imagine you are facing a great challenge, something that seems impossible to solve. Maybe it's a project at work, a relationship problem, or a difficult financial situation. The story of Joshua and Jericho may serve as a reminder that the strongest walls we have ahead of us can, indeed, be brought down. And the key is not in using brute force, but in following God's plan, trusting His direction, and obeying with faith. This might mean being patient, taking a step back, and waiting for the right moment to act. It's also an invitation to reflect on how we face the difficulties in life. Are we trying to bring down the walls on our own, or are we trusting in something greater? The Bible is full of examples that show us that true victories do not come from human effort, but from divine assistance. And Jericho is the clearest proof that when we follow God's plan, even the strongest walls can be reduced to dust. This story, the story of the destruction of the walls of Jericho, may be more relevant to you than it seems. Often, our tendency is to fight with all our might, but the truth is that by following God's will, solutions often come in unexpected ways. Now, we can begin to reflect on how our own walls, whether emotional or spiritual, can be brought down, and what faith can do when we allow ourselves to act with wisdom and confidence. The faith and obedience of the Israelites during the Battle of Jericho are nothing short of impressive. God, in His wisdom, gave Joshua a strategy that defied all human understanding. Yet, the Israelites did not hesitate. They followed the instructions to the letter. They marched silently for 6 days around the city, without questioning, without murmuring. Only on the 7th day, with a collective shout, the walls of Jericho fell. The victory was not the result of strength, but of pure faith and unconditional obedience. This story is a clear example that many times, faith in God and obedience to His instructions are the keys to achieving victory, even in the face of the greatest difficulties. This principle of faith and obedience resonates in our own lives. How many times, when faced with challenges, is our first reaction to try to solve everything with our own resources and abilities? Often, we forget that true strength comes from our faith and obedience to God's direction. The story of Jericho teaches us that even when we do not understand the strategy or the path to follow, the important thing is to trust in what God is asking us to do. When we surrender to this trust, no matter how big the wall ahead of us may be, it will fall. Imagine a scenario where you are struggling to reach an important goal, such as building a business or achieving a personal dream. The solution may not be to follow the traditional path, but rather to trust in God and follow His instructions, even when they seem to make no sense. Victory through faith doesn't mean everything will be easy, but that divine direction will be more than enough to overcome any obstacle. By acting with faith, even when the solution isn't clear, you are putting into practice the same principle that caused the walls of Jericho to fall. In moments of doubt, it's vital to remember that obedience to God is not about understanding all the answers, but about trusting in His plan. Just as the Israelites marched around Jericho without knowing exactly what would happen, we too need to learn to trust that God is in control and has a perfect plan, even when we don't see the full picture. This requires humility and a willingness to set aside our own logic, placing our faith in something greater. This journey of faith and obedience is not limited to the story of Jericho. It is an eternal principle that applies to all aspects of life. And as we move forward, we will see how the spies and Rahab's faith contributed to the success of this divine mission. The story of Jericho takes a significant turn when 2 Israelite spies are sent into the city. Their mission was simple: gather vital information about Jericho's defenses. However, what happens next is a surprise. They find shelter in an unlikely place, the house of Rahab, a woman with a questionable past. But contrary to what might be expected, Rahab recognizes the power of God and believes that he will deliver Jericho into the hands of the Israelites. She then hides the spies and helps them escape. Because of her courage and faith, Rahab and her family are spared when the city is destroyed. This shows us that, regardless of our past, faith in God can change our story. Rahab, a woman of questionable morals in the eyes of humans, plays a crucial role in the story of Jericho's fall. Her actions are a clear example that God uses those who, in the eyes of society, would be discarded. But Rahab didn't look at her past. She looked at the greatness of God. By deciding to help the spies, she demonstrated a faith that placed her at the center of God's plan. Sometimes, we need to stop focusing on our own flaws and start focusing on the greatness of God, recognizing that He can use us in extraordinary ways, regardless of our history. This example is also valuable for all of us who often doubt our abilities or feel that our past failures disqualify us from great things. Rahab teaches us that it doesn't matter where we come from. What matters is where we're going with God by our side. When we put our faith into action, as Rahab did, we can be powerful instruments in fulfilling the divine plan. Rahab's story is a reminder that God doesn't choose the perfect, but those who have a heart willing to act with faith. Imagine the impact Rahab's faith had, not only for herself but for her entire family. The miracle was not only for the Israelites, but also for those who, in an act of faith, recognized God's hand. And this faith was not passive. It was a faith that acted, that did something to change the situation. Many times, in our own lives, we need to take that step of faith, even when the situation seems uncertain, knowing that God will honor our obedience and trust as He did with Rahab. Thus, as we see Rahab's faith and how she played a crucial role in the story of Jericho, we must reflect on how, in our own lives, we can be like her. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't happen in large crowds or with great heroes, but in silent and courageous acts of faith, like that of a woman who, seemingly insignificant, became part of something much bigger than herself. Rahab's faith paved the way for others to also experience God's grace. And this leads us to think about how our faith can be the key to transforming others. Now, before we explore the crossing of the Jordan River, let's consider how our own faith can be a bridge to something greater. Before the Battle of Jericho, the Israelites faced another great challenge: crossing the Jordan River. The river was overflowing, and humanly speaking, it seemed impossible to cross. But, as in so many other situations, God provided a solution that defied all logic. Joshua, guided by God, ordered the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant and place it in the waters. When the priest's feet touched the water, the river parted, allowing the people of Israel to cross on dry land. This miracle not only reaffirmed God's power, but also solidified the people's trust in His guidance. The crossing of the Jordan, just like the falling of the walls of Jericho, was a testimony that when God is leading, nothing is impossible. This crossing is, symbolically, a powerful representation of the challenges we face in life. Sometimes, our Jordan rivers are great obstacles that seem insurmountable. It could be a financial problem, a health situation, or a personal challenge that makes us question whether we can really move forward. But just as the river was divided, we can also trust that God will provide a way, even when everything around us says otherwise. The victory through faith and the miracle of the Jordan teach us that when we put our trust in God, He opens doors that seem completely closed. However, for the miracle to happen, a step of faith was required. Joshua and the priests didn't know exactly how the miracle would happen. They simply followed God's instructions, even without fully understanding what was to come. And this is a crucial lesson for us. True faith doesn't come from fully understanding every situation, but from obeying what God asks of us, even when we don't see the solution right away. Many times, God calls us to take a step of faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. When we face our own rivers, it is important to reflect on how willing we are to trust and obey, even when the solution is not clear. What would make you take a bold step toward what seems impossible. Perhaps it's a difficult decision, an action you know you need to take, but you're afraid to take the first step. Remember, the crossing of the Jordan is a reminder that when we put our faith into action, God guides us and leads us beyond what we can imagine. He doesn't ask us to understand everything, just to trust. As we reflect on how this crossing was essential for the people of Israel, we can think about how, in our own lives, we face our own Jordan rivers. Now, before we continue to explore the symbolism of the scarlet cord, think about what would be necessary for you to take the next step of faith in your journey, even in the face of obstacles that seem insurmountable. Rahab, the woman of faith, not only a despised but also did something significant that would become a symbol of salvation for her and her family. She tied a scarlet cord to the window of her house as a sign for the Israelites during the destruction of Jericho. This cord was not just a piece of thread, but a powerful symbol of protection and redemption. It served as a reminder of God's promise to save those who, by faith, place themselves under his protection. The scarlet cord is a profound metaphor for the sacrifice of Christ, who also brought salvation through his spilled blood. The red cord, with its vibrant color, symbolized more than just a simple marker. It represented Rahab's trust in God and her adherence to his word. When the Israelites marched through Jericho and destroyed the city, any house that had the scarlet cord was marked to be spared. This scene, where a simple cord became the difference between destruction and salvation, is a powerful reminder to us that in our lives, divine protection is available to those who surrender to his direction. Rahab's faith made her an example of salvation, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. And we cannot forget that the scarlet cord symbolizes the blood of Christ, which also offers us protection and redemption. In the Old Testament, this symbol was a physical sign of salvation, but in the New Testament, it points to something even deeper, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Just as Rahab trusted that the scarlet cord would save her, we can trust that the blood of Christ offers us true salvation. The symbolism of the scarlet cord teaches us that faith in a greater sacrifice not only guarantees our protection, but also the transformation of our lives. This leads us to reflect on what we are placing in our lives as a sign of our faith. Rahab's scarlet cord was a tangible act of trust in God. And in our lives, what are the signs that demonstrate our trust in God? Maybe it's an act of obedience, a change in attitude, or even a choice to trust, even when circumstances seem unfavorable. When we follow God's direction, even in the smallest details, we place ourselves under his protection. As we reflect on the symbolism of the scarlet cord, we can also think about how our own faith choices position us to live out God's promises. And as the story of Jericho progresses, it's impossible to overlook how this faith was strengthened when Joshua had an encounter with the commander of the army of the Lord. Let's explore how this encounter paved the way for the battle that followed. Before the Battle of Jericho began, Joshua had an experience that deeply marked the history of the people of Israel. He had a direct encounter with the commander of the army of the Lord. This encounter was not a simple moment of prayer or reflection, but a clear manifestation of God's presence. When Joshua approached the man, asking if he was friend or foe, the response was revealing. "I am the commander of the army of the Lord." In that instant, Joshua understood that the battle was not his, but God's. He bowed before the commander, recognizing that the victory was already guaranteed, because it was God who was in control of everything. This moment is of extreme importance, because it reminds us that the battles of life are often not ours to fight alone. The story of Joshua and Jericho teaches us that when we align ourselves with God's plan, he takes the lead in the battle. When we trust in his guidance and surrender our problems into his hands, the victory is no longer based on what we can do, but on what he has already done for us. Faith in God as the true commander of our lives gives us the confidence we need to move forward, even when the challenges seem insurmountable. Just as Joshua was instructed to follow God's orders, we too are called to listen to and obey his voice. Sometimes, our tendency is to try to resolve everything with our own strength, but true power comes from aligning with the divine will. Joshua, By bowing before the commander, recognized that the success of the mission was in God's hands, and he would not need to rely on his own strength to conquer the city. This is a great example of humility and wisdom, knowing that no matter how capable we are, our true strength comes from God. This encounter with Joshua also challenges us to reflect on how we position ourselves in relation to God. Are we, like Joshua, willing to listen and obey, even when the strategy seems unusual? The Battle of Jericho was won not by human strength, but by divine direction. And as we reflect on this in our lives, we can begin to realize that the answers to our struggles often come from a place of faith and surrender, not from our own effort. This prepares us to understand the psychological and strategic impact of the silent march. As we reflect on the power of this divine encounter, we can ask ourselves, how are we allowing God to be the commander in our lives? Are we so focused on our personal strategies that we fail to listen to divine direction? Next, we will analyze how the silent march around Jericho created such a strong psychological impact, weakening the morale of the city's inhabitants. The war strategy in Jericho, commanded by Joshua, was more than just a military tactic. It was a true form of psychological warfare. For 6 days, the Israelites marched around the city in absolute silence, making no aggressive moves or showing any signs of intent. Only the priests played the trumpets, creating an atmosphere of growing anticipation. However, the silence was more powerful than any shout. The city of Jericho, with its towering walls, was protected, but fear began to grow inside it. The inhabitants of Jericho, upon seeing the Israelites march in silence, started to question their own certainties. What seemed like a simple march transformed into immense psychological pressure, dismantling the confidence the city's inhabitants had in their own security. This type of psychological warfare is not something reserved only for biblical times. In our everyday lives, we also face moments when things seem calm on the outside, but there's an internal pressure taking place. It could be the tension before a big event, the anticipation before a major decision, or the build-up in a significant project. Psychological warfare is everywhere, and as in Jericho, it can be used effectively to weaken any resistance. The Israelites knew that the battle wouldn't be won solely by strength, but by the ability to create a climate of anxiety and doubt in the hearts of their enemies. This psychological warfare technique is still used today in various situations, such as negotiations and even competitions. Now, you might ask, how does this apply to our personal lives? Perhaps you are preparing to face a big challenge, and instead of rushing to fight or acting impulsively, the secret might be in waiting for the right moment, creating strategic anticipation. Just like the Israelites, in silence, prepared the ground for the final action, we can use time to our advantage. It doesn't need to be literal silence, but rather strategic patience, where we maintain our calm and wait for divine intervention at the right time. Silence is not weakness. In fact, it can be one of the most powerful ways to act. Imagine that. Instead of rushing your decisions, you chose to act with patience and confidence, knowing that when the right moment arrives, victory will be yours. This principle of psychological warfare can be extremely effective, not just in literal battles, but also in our own daily conflicts, whether at work, in relationships, or even in our own thoughts and emotions. As we reflect on the silent march, the lesson we can take away is that often, in silence and patience, our greatest victory is built. As the Israelites prepared for the final shout, the city of Jericho was already weakened, psychologically vulnerable. Let's think about how we can use the power of strategic silence in our own lives before moving on to the moment that truly caused a final impact: the sound of the trumpets and the shout of faith. The culminating moment of the Battle of Jericho occurred when the Israelites gave a collective shout and the priests blew the trumpets. This act of worship and obedience was not just a physical sound, but a powerful symbol of faith in action. What seemed like just a religious ceremony turned into a divine catalyst that brought down the walls of the city. The trumpets were not played for any random reason. They were in tune with the will of God. The collective shout of the Israelites was also not merely noise, but an expression of complete trust that, no matter how improbable victory seemed, God was in control and the battle was already won. The story of Jericho teaches us a great lesson about the power of worship and obedience. Often, in our everyday lives, when facing difficulties, we seek solutions that rely only on our own efforts. But in Jericho, the solution was an act of worship, a clear sign that victory came from God, not human power. Worship in this context was not just singing songs or praying, but a tangible act of faith. The people of Israel demonstrated their obedience in a practical way. They faithfully followed God's instructions without deviating from the plan, and this generated a supernatural impact. This is a point of reflection for us. How many times in our lives do we find ourselves trying to solve everything on our own without resorting to divine power through prayer, worship, and obedience? When we worship God, we are not just participating in a ceremony, but we are activating a power that can transform our reality. By acting in obedience, we are not only doing what we were told, but also aligning ourselves with God's purpose. Victory through faith does not come from our own efforts, but from our ability to submit to God's will with a heart full of trust. In practice, this means that instead of trying to control everything, we can start handing over our concerns to God. By doing so, our worship and obedience become the foundation upon which miracles happen. For example, in moments of stress or difficulty, instead of panicking, we can choose peace and trust in God. Just as the Israelites obeyed and worshiped, even when the plan seemed improbable, we too can act in faith, believing that God is working on our behalf. This powerful lesson of worship and obedience leads us to reflect on how we can apply it to our daily lives. Are we so focused on our own methods that we forget to place our full trust in God? As the story of Jericho progresses, we will see the role of complete devotion to God, which ensured the final victory. But before we reach that point, let us reflect on the impact of our own obedience and worship. When the walls of Jericho finally fell, the victory was undeniable, but the mission was far from over. God commanded that everything in the city be destroyed, except for Rahab and her family, who had shown faith. This act of complete devotion to God was a clear instruction. All the gold, silver, and goods of the city were to be consecrated to God. There was to be no attempt to accumulate wealth or goods from the city for the personal benefit of the Israelites. Everything was to be destroyed, except what was designated for the glory of God. The victory was not just over the city of Jericho, but over the faithfulness and purity of the hearts of the people of Israel. This total consecration reflects a principle we see throughout the Bible. God demands complete obedience without deviation. The victory at Jericho was not only a demonstration of God's power, but a lesson about what it means to place everything in God's hands. By destroying the entire city and consecrating everything to God, the Israelites demonstrated that they were willing to follow his instructions completely, withholding nothing for themselves. This symbolizes a type of surrender that God desires from us, total devotion, where we hold nothing back but offer everything to him. For us, this may seem like a difficult task. We live in a world where the accumulation of wealth and goods is encouraged, and often we find ourselves struggling against the temptation to keep something for ourselves. But the story of Jericho teaches us that when we are faithful in our devotion to God, he blesses us in ways we cannot foresee. It's not just about obedience, but about recognizing that everything we have comes from God, and that our true reward is not in material things, but in our faithfulness to him. This also challenges us to reflect on what we are holding back for ourselves. Are we willing to give everything to God, even the areas we consider most precious in our lives? This could include our time, our finances, and even our relationships. The story of Jericho teaches us that true victory comes when we surrender everything to God, trusting that he knows what is best for us and that obedience to him will yield the best results. With this lesson of devotion and total surrender, we move to the impact of Joshua's words about the city and the curse that followed, which warned against the rebuilding of Jericho. This leads us to think about what remains in our lives after making a decision of complete surrender to God. After the fall of Jericho, Joshua pronounced a curse on anyone who tried to rebuild the city. He declared that whoever dared to restore Jericho would do so at the cost of their own destruction. Joshua's curse was a measure of divine protection, a way to ensure that the city, which had been dedicated to God, would not be profaned. What followed was the fulfillment of this curse. Many years later, during the reign of King Ahab, a man named Hiel of Bethel attempted to rebuild Jericho. He paid a terrible price for this attempt, losing his sons in the process. This episode is a clear reminder that disobeying divine instructions can have profound consequences. The curse that fell on those who would rebuild Jericho is a lesson about the sanctity of what God consecrates. Jericho was completely destroyed, not only because it symbolized God's victory, but because God wanted to ensure his purpose was fulfilled irreversibly. The city, which had been dedicated to God, could not be treated with disrespect. This episode makes us reflect on how we treat the things that God consecrates in our lives. Are we respecting divine instructions and keeping what he has consecrated in holiness? Or are we attempting to rebuild what he has destroyed according to his will? This principle applies in many areas of our lives. When making important decisions, such as committing to our faith, our career, or our relationships, we must remember that when we consecrate something to God, he has total control over it. Often, we may be tempted to rebuild or manipulate a situation that God has already placed in his plans. But the story of Jericho teaches us that when something is consecrated to God, he alone determines the destiny of that situation. The temptation to rebuild may be strong, but the results can be devastating. Moreover, the story of Jericho's curse also speaks to the importance of continuous obedience. Joshua didn't just defeat Jericho. He ensured that the city was completely consecrated to God. The lesson here is that when we make the decision to follow God's will, we need to follow through to the end without trying to reverse or modify the conditions he has set. The curse of Jericho shows us that disobedience to God is not a trivial matter, but it can have serious consequences. Reflecting on this, we can think about areas in our lives where we have tried to rebuild what God has already destroyed or consecrated to him. How are we respecting the sanctity of the decisions we make in his direction? As we move forward, we will see how modern archaeology has shown tangible evidence of Jericho, further confirming the reality of this story. When the story of Jericho was recorded in the Bible, it seemed like a narrative of epic proportions. The walls falling miraculously, a city destroyed, and a victorious people. However, many skeptics question the truthfulness of these accounts, until over time, archaeological excavations began to provide surprising evidence. Excavations of Jericho, conducted over several decades, revealed traces that matched the biblical description of the wall's collapse. Archaeological evidence, such as the remains of the walls that truly collapsed in a manner similar to what is described in the Bible, offers impressive confirmation that the story of Jericho is not just a legend, but a real account of historical and miraculous events. These archaeological discoveries are fascinating because they show that the Bible is not only a collection of spiritual stories, but also a record of historical events that can be confirmed through science. The walls of Jericho, for example, did not fall gradually, as one would expect in a conventional attack. Instead, the evidence shows that the walls of Jericho collapsed inward into the city, a discovery that precisely matches what is described in the book of Joshua. This gives us a sense that, even today, the truth of God and his work are confirmed through discoveries made by humanity. But the significance of this archaeological evidence is not just in the confirmation of the event itself, but in how it challenges us to reflect on the accuracy of the scriptures. The story of Jericho and its archaeological confirmation teaches us that God's promises are always faithful, just like the promises of his word. When the Bible says that something will happen, we can trust that the truth behind it will be revealed, whether in a divine miracle or in a scientific discovery. This reinforces our confidence that God not only fulfills his plans, but also leaves signs of his action so that we can witness them and understand his faithfulness. This connection between faith and archaeology is fascinating because it not only validates the story of Jericho, but also challenges us to look at biblical accounts with a new perspective. If specific and miraculous events, like the fall of the walls of Jericho, can be confirmed by science, then it is a reminder that God, the creator of the universe, is active in the world, even if we can't always see him with our eyes. It is proof that when we trust in his word, we are trusting in something that is truly firm. As we reflect on these discoveries, we can ask ourselves how we are allowing the truth of God to guide us. Are we willing to trust in what he reveals, even when it seems contradictory to what we see in our lives or in the sciences? The story of Jericho and its archaeological confirmation teaches us unwavering faith that when God acts, he does so in a grand and visible way. And as we do so, let's explore the legacy of Jericho and how it echoes into today's world. The story of Jericho does not end with the destruction of the city or with the falling of the walls. The legacy of Jericho is much deeper and ongoing, affecting generations of Israelites and even us today in our daily challenges. The Battle of Jericho became a powerful symbol of faith, obedience, and divine intervention. Over the centuries, this story has been told and retold, reminding us that no matter the difficulties we face, victory does not depend on our strength, but on our faith and trust in God. The legacy of Jericho teaches us that when we follow God's instructions and act with obedience, miracles can happen. This legacy is also a reminder that the obedience of a people can impact an entire nation. Jericho was the first city to be conquered after crossing the Jordan River, and the victory over it set the tone for future battles. Victory through faith became a standard for the Israelites, a model for how they should approach the battles they would face in the future. The story of Jericho, therefore, is not just about an isolated event, but about a shift in the way the Israelites viewed the battles they encountered. They began to understand that, instead of relying on their own strength, they should trust completely in God. In our lives, the legacy of Jericho can manifest in many ways. When we face our own Jerichos, those obstacles that seem insurmountable, we can remember that true strength is not in our abilities, but in our capacity to listen to and obey God. Like the Israelites, often our victory depends on our willingness to follow instructions that at first glance may seem unusual. The example of Jericho challenges us to act with faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. The legacy of Jericho also teaches us about the importance of consecrating our victories to God. When the walls fell, everything was destroyed and consecrated to God, except for Rahab's family. This reminds us that, as we achieve our own triumphs, we should dedicate all that we have and are to God, recognizing that he is the source of our victory. The true legacy of Jericho, therefore, is a call to faithfulness, obedience, and total dedication to God. As we reflect on the legacy of Jericho, we can ask ourselves, how are we responding to the challenges we face? Are we trusting in our own strength, or are we placing our trust in God? The story of Jericho continues to be a testimony that, with faith and obedience, we can overcome any obstacle that comes our way. And as we look to the legacy of Jericho, we see that, regardless of the difficulties, God's victory is certain. The story of Jericho challenges us to look at our own walls and ask, what are we doing to bring them down? Are we trying to conquer our battles with our own strength, or are we willing to trust and obey God's plan, no matter how strange it may seem? Victory doesn't come from brute force, but from faith that leads us to act with confidence in God's power. Jericho teaches us that when we obey God, even the highest and most impenetrable walls can fall. Now, I ask you, what are the walls you've been facing in your life? Are you ready to act in faith, just as the people of Israel did, and allow God to intervene in an extraordinary way? If you feel ready to follow this example, then don't waste time and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications to continue learning how to apply these powerful lessons of faith and victory in your life. Don't let your walls stand any longer. It's time to bring them down with the strength of your faith.